Hey everybody, this is Joel Burkle. I'm going to be starting off this collaborative presentation that I am working on with my friend and colleague Alyssa Carr. And we've been assigned the community section of the Multimodality and Motion Kairos article. And so I will be walking us through a summary of the first two pages before handing it off to Alyssa, who will handle the second two pages. So I want to provide a brief breakdown and emphasize that anyone can come back to this portion or hit pause to come back and sort of resituate yourself into this breakdown if you get lost in what follows. So essentially the exigence here is the need for more inclusive language and spaces with a focus on psychiatric accessibility, which is a spectrum of disabilities that are often labeled as mentally ill and then treated homogeneously. And so that's a big part of her argument, is that when we label an entire spectrum as just one term, mentally ill, it sort of flattens that spectrum in ways that are dangerous. So the argument is that if we can change these attitudes in ways that influence the design of the spaces we use, we can make spaces that are more inclusive to a variety of disability and accessibility issues. Some of the key terms that we'll be looking at today include safe/safer space, this idea of getting in versus fitting in, mentally ill versus psychiatrically disabled, the difference in those two terms, deterministic screens from Kenneth Burke, inclusive language, and community. And the alternatives that are offered in this text are that we think about the language that we use, that we consider going beyond a brief mention of the Office for Disability Studies, right? Instead of that short plug, maybe spending more time really emphasizing that and showing that we value that. Checking in on students who are missing class or seem to be having difficulty with content. Making our expectations completely transparent, and being willing to consider alternative assignment formats for a variety of students. And this is better because it extends issues beyond merely physical access. So while accessibility studies that pay attention to physical access are important, they are not the only accessibility, they are not the only aspects of accessibility that we need to pay attention to. So first we are going to dive into the community page. And here she notes that in our calls for greater access, she's asking for more than fixes to environments. And instead, we're calling for a shift in how we imagine our students, coworkers, and audiences, right? So we shouldn't be going into environments and saying, how can I fix this issue that has come up because of X, Y, or Z? But instead thinking about sort of anticipating those types of issues by imagining our students, by considering a variety of audiences, and including those aspects in the actual design from the beginning, rather than looking back when issues emerge. And so again, when she talks about these welcoming attitudes, she's really calling attention to mental issues in addition to just physical issues. She's concerned with the idea that a variety of mental issues are not considered when we talk about accessibility, but those are nonetheless still issues. Those are still barriers for a large portion of our audience that are engaging with these various materials that we put out and the designs that we create. And towards this notion, she introduces the concept of fitting in as opposed to just getting in. She says the motivation behind access, after all, is not simply that individuals can enter buildings, navigate websites, or get the class notes, for example, but that they can be part of the community. Right? So it's really thinking about design in ways that are not just focusing on getting individuals into buildings or onto sites, but being able to work within those buildings and within those sites, regardless of whatever types of inaccessibility issues or accessibility issues that they might have. She then talks about key changes, and I really like this portion because she emphasizes that we must move from language to thinking, right? So when we shift the language we use, we can shift the way that we and others think. And alongside this, when we shift our attitudes about these spaces, we can then shift these spaces. So she writes that the design of physical and web spaces reflects the designer's attitudes about who the users are, and the absence of accessible spaces results in what Price calls the cumulative absence of disabled people in our institutions. Of course, creating accommodations and designing accessible spaces and texts will eventually change attitudes about who belongs in certain spaces and how spaces, texts look and function. So I would say we should notice the circularity here, right? The designer's attitudes influence us because we adapt to and thus think through those platforms. But at the same time, if we use these spaces in ways that are maximally accessible to all users, then these spaces will have to accommodate us toward doing such work. For example, and she uses this one, if we're always using closed captioning, right? If we're thinking beforehand about our videos, the need for closed captioning, then video platforms will begin to make closed captioning an easier process because of the demands of the users, right? So while we are, as teachers, we are, as in one sense, designers and users, right? And as we design our own unique spaces and provide feedback, we can actually change how these spaces function.